Today, we're going to look at hacking life and hacking old school whiskey. Now, Macallan whiskey as well. Whoa, even better. Anyway, there are very few bottles of whiskey from the 1920s, 30s, 40s and 50s that survive, especially bottles of Macallan. One of the ones that does survive is obviously this Macallan Glenlivet 22-year-old. But what happens if you are not as bothered about authenticity, but you wanted to really try and see what whiskey was like in the 20s, 30s and 40s? Well, you know what? Back in the day, Macallan had your back because they had the Macallan Decades Travel Series. You may have seen these at auction. These are these badass little bottles. They're quite novelty bottlings that were released in the early 2000s, and they aim to replicate the style of Macallan from the 20s, 30s, 40s and 50s. And we're going to talk about the problem with the replica series in another video, but there was a huge scandal about the replica series. But these 20s, 30s, 40s and 50s sample bottles that were used to replicate the style of Macallan for these series was more reliable. And essentially this Travel Decade series is the 20s bottle tastes like whiskey from the 20s. Macallan whiskey from the 20s. The 30s tastes like 30s whiskey, Macallan whiskey from the 30s, 40s and 50s and so on. They were a bargain. They were about £30 a bottle. Look at this from the Whisky Exchange when they were originally released. It's an absolute bargain, £30 a bottle. And each one obviously displays, the boxes are quite cool because you can turn them all around and you've got one big image, but they represent a mode of transport that was novel during that decade, hence Travel Series. So the 20s, you've got the automobile, the 30s, you've got the cruise liner or ship or ocean vessel, whatever you want to call it. The 40s, ocean vessel, what the hell? Anyway, 40s got trains or locomotives, and then in the 50s, of course, you've got aviation and aeroplanes. Now, these whiskies critically tend to be like Marmite, and that's what I find particularly interesting about them. Marmite because you either love them or hate them, and also because what the hell is going on with critical reviews? Like, first of all, though, you've got to understand that these whiskies, including this Macallan here, was made using completely different production techniques than you would see today. It's made using completely different strains of barley that are available today commercially, and just even production techniques in terms of how the stills and how the distilleries were being controlled rather than being computers. It would have been a lot more manual. So these whiskies do represent a style of whiskey that isn't available today, and as such that might be slightly polarizing in terms of people's opinions on them. Now, this series highlights this brilliantly because if you look at Whiskey Fun, we'll put that on screen now, they average, well, there's 73 to 77 points each, which is pretty bad. Now, Serge is a legend of tasting whiskey and everybody would respect his opinion, 73 to 77 points. But there's somebody else who reviewed these whiskies that gave them 92 to 94 points. And he is also someone who is incredibly well respected, Michael Jackson. No, not that Michael Jackson, the whiskey legend that is Michael Jackson. So you've got like a 73 to 77 point score from Whiskey Fun is brutal. You know, that's basically saying it's wet and alcoholic. With Michael Jackson's 92 to 94 is saying, wow, this is pretty damn sublime. And again, we'll put the pictures, it's on page 330 of the 6th edition 2010. Anyway, they're interesting bottles. They're interesting because of they're an opportunity to try these styles of whiskies that you wouldn't necessarily be able to try today. They're also interesting because of the price points. You know, the 20s, they all range typically between £300 and £600 at auction. And there's occasionally anomalous results where you get £700 to £900 for a bottle. And that's where somebody might be trying to complete that set. But the huge rise in value that we've seen across the rest of the market hasn't really applied to these Travel Series bottles. So there's still quite an affordable way to make a nice little collection of bottles. You know, you're looking at £1,500 to sort of £2,000 to make the complete set. Again, it's quite overlooked. Now, what I think there is interesting with these bottles is that you've got a twofold thing. You've got a style of whiskey that you're not able to buy and that's been recreated before. And again, these are way cheaper than the replica series bottles. They're sort of 800 to or 500 to £1,000 each. So they're a much more affordable option. But again, if you are one of those sadists who open bottles of whiskey, then it's a really good opportunity to try some fantastic whiskey that isn't going to cost the earth. This little beauty though, this little 10 milliliter dram, even a third of a dram, 100 quid. It's a lot of money, but you know what? Life is for living, and if you've got the means to try something like this, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. So anyway, go and buy the Travel Series if you want a nice affordable series of Macallan bottles to try and drink. And if you want to try some genuine whiskey that was distilled in the 1920s and bottled in the 1940s, then these are the drams for you.